There's a fan blowing in this direction, and I can see it's pushing my hair across, and I'm trying to decide if it's going to annoy me or not. And I don't think it is. I think I'd rather have the additional airflow. So here we are. I hope you can't hear it. Today on the podcast, welcome. We are going to do three things. We're going to talk about the podcast, which is very meta, and then I'm going to discuss my recent training, which is to say, if we discussed last week what the intent was, what the goals were, and why I feel that they are achievable, today we'll talk about what the training has looked like in pursuit of those goals. So that would be largely from July 2024 to now, which is February 27, 2025. Did I say 23 or 24? 2024. So I think it's seven-ish, maybe 8 months ago. Time flies. I will give a little context prior to that because life did not begin in July of last year. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll answer some questions related to things that I wish that was the inquiry that I wished I prioritized earlier in my sporting career. And a little adjunct to that question was what to do when life throws a curveball. So, like, basically, what to do with training when life happens. Next question will be the person from memory. They want to know whether they should train or sleep after a night of no sleep or at least very shit sleep. We've all been there. Third question relates to my Beijing 2008 Olympic campaign in the Australian men's eight. So I will discuss that from my point of view. It's all I can represent. So to start with the podcast, it's been fun so far. I have had to will myself at times, like I imagine some of you have to with training on occasion to do this, especially when it's just me. I have to sit down and I have to basically make an appointment with myself to like go fucking go do it. Because right now, do I want to do this? No, but do I believe that the other the bigger the version of me that does want to do this, and so I'm here, and this is what it's like sometimes. Sometimes with training, you don't want to do it, but you want to attain the goal, and you understand that this is a necessary part of the process. Even if the goal is just to learn from the process, it means you have to actually go through with it. You have to do the thing, and that's regardless of whether it's easy or not. And I don't find this easy, and that's largely because I have minimal experience and because I'm pretty critical of myself, which means that if I get feedback, you can almost be certain that it's something I've noticed or considered. I have a hard time. I can watch podcasts and my podcast and listen to it in chunks, but the whole thing is it feels like a lot of sand, which is the idea, because I'm the common feature. The other feature is the guests I have on, and part of figuring it out is we're doing a little dance here, and it's going to be different with each person. How much is it an interview versus a conversation? And I enjoy podcasts and have done since I think 2010, 11, which is pretty early adopter. And I like a very clinical, hyper edited interview format. I also am a Joe Rogan early adopter, so I'm also quite happy to have a record start on the conversation for it to take maybe 3 hours. I've never felt an issue with having to just pause it and come back to that. It seems to be an issue for some. They want this packaged in 45 minutes because that's the typical commute. But what happens if at 45 minutes in a conversation, you're actually just getting into the good stuff? And so I don't want to put a time limit. And the reason for the lack of editing is I've played around with some software that might take out the ums and ahs and so's and buts and the dead space, polish it up a little bit, and that might happen. I would still like to be able to present the conversation for even for social media instead of this, we're side by side. So does, how do we stack? There is a way to do this. I just don't know what it is yet. And I think that that's probably less important than the actual craft of conversation with interesting people. And because people are enjoying the podcast, they're suggesting who should come on, and sometimes it's people that I'm already considering. A couple of times it's been people I've already recorded with but not published, and sometimes it's people I don't really know. They might have some accomplishments and then they play a sport for their country. Maybe they're an Olympian, but uh, I know most of my friends are Olympians, so that can't be the thing. Even Olympic medalists is not a point of difference. So the point of difference is pretty intangible because it's what makes a person interesting is not necessarily just the things that they've done, but perhaps how they've gone about it, their lives. So again, the context in which these things occurred, that might be the interesting thing. It might even be that they're not an athlete or a coach, but a person that is engaged with the process of training and takes it very seriously, but it's just not the thing they do professionally. So it's a thing that they might not even share a lot of, but I happen to know that is a meaningful thing to me, to them. So those are the sort of conversations that I like to have more than just so and so that did a thing. Doing a thing is great, but there needs to be some sort of additional attributes, and that's purely subjective. And I would like to think these are all conversations with people that are interesting, but they have to at least be interesting to me. Otherwise, it could never work, and I'm sure you understand why. I will mention one thing with the podcast and learning on the job, and I talk about this in one or two episodes with an Olympic gold medalist, and I'm talking about a podcast I did with another Olympic gold medalist in track and field who broke the world record in the Olympic final. And we had a great chat. And when I went to end the recording, it wasn't recording. So instead of stopping the thing, my heart like fell out my asshole, and then I couldn't own it at the time because we'd gone pretty deep, and it was sort of, in that refractory period, we're shaking it off, and I didn't have the heart to, so I took about 24 hours to process, and I'll elaborate on it in a future conversation I have with a yet as named Olympic gold medalist. But that's a mistake I hope to only make once. And it kept me up at night, mate, what an idiot, just excoriating myself. And if that's not the thing to do, I don't know how else to register that, what does ownership look like practically if it's not paying attention enough to the moment so that you're aware that this is not something you want to relive. Like I felt really bad for him because just like maybe a waste of time. I was having those thoughts like I've wasted this person's time, which I hate to do. And then just the lack of proficiency in this thing that I'm aspiring to be competent at least. And this was very lacking in competency. But we live and we learn, and we're pressing record now. Let's just like check. Yeah, okay. No, we're still recording here. Terrific. Which brings me to recent training. First, let me just have a little sip of water. The thing with a solo podcast and not editing is that you have to sit here and perhaps listen or watch me have a little drink. I do this a lot when I ask a question of a guest, and then I can see that they're about to say something of note and maybe of length, and then I know I'm constantly trying to rehydrate, but I also feel a little parched. Okay, recent training. Recent training is just from the point where I declared my intentions of a 300 kilogram deadlift and a sub 3 hour marathon on the same day or on the same weekend, or maybe just the same 24 hours to be determined. I said that's the thing that I want to do. And I made some inroads prior to that, the smallest inroads possible. I'd done virtually no running for 10 years. So prior to that, I was a decent runner, given all of the obvious non-runner attributes I have. So if I was in good running shape, good running fitness, uninjured, I could run pretty well. It wasn't this thing that I had all the time, but more and more that was the thing I could do. And then I had added in quite a bit of resistance training, and eating, and gained some weight, and running became harder. And this is about the time where I was more invested in the world records on the erg at the shorter distances, originally 1,000 meters. So stronger, stronger, stronger. That seemed to make output on the erg feel easier, which made the idea of going under 120 for 1,000 meters seem pretty feasible, seeing as a 17-year-old, I could do it for 500 meters. So give it another, 15 years. Yeah, that's a reasonable to be able to sustain that power for or a little bit more than that power for double the distance. And I backed that I could, and I did. But in that time, running didn't really serve a purpose anymore. It was sort of the antithesis of what I was going after, which was an emphasis on real quality, power, recovery, adaptation. And running can be catabolic, especially if you're heavier. It's hard on the body, and it was just another training stress that would need to be adapted to rather than something that would help benefit the process. I did some hill sprints for a while during that period, and always a lot of walking, but never no running other than across the road for a decade, until I, for whatever reason, decided at that point in time that this was the thing that I wanted to do. It's because I've always wanted to, with the marathon, always wanted to run a sub 3 hour marathon from the time that I wanted to run a marathon, which is about the time that I figured that under 3:15 was a reasonable goal. And when I ran 3:14 in 2009, I thought, okay, well, I would like to run a sub 3 hour marathon eventually. And then time passes. I can't be the only one here that has these aspirations, but for one reason or another, you don't quite get to them immediately. And my reasons were because I was doing other things with my body at the tip of the spear. So a big opportunity for lack of specificity. And I'm pretty pleased that I could say that word more or less on the first go. Specificity, not bad. So as you get more specific, things get less general, and I didn't have running goals, so I didn't run. And then all of the, running fitness that I felt that when I had, and that's the thing I was saying before, when I could run well and I'm running shape and no injuries, that I'm a decent runner relative to my goals. All those caveats. I'm never even a good runner. I'm just saying I could get closer to being a good runner. And then that went away because I wasn't training it, and because it wasn't an innate skill, and because I was doing things in the opposite direction, mostly gaining size. And even like this is all post rowing, and it's good for a whole bunch of reasons. I like it, but it's not helpful for running. And most of this has been accumulated since I stopped running. So I believe that the goal is achievable, and all we're doing is undertaking the process to move in that direction. Did I think that maybe I would be further along at this stage? Definitely. But I wasn't tied to, there's so much uncertainty. You have to take it as it comes, which means you can't be completely tied to any one rate of progression. This is particularly important if your goal is something that you haven't touched recently. So if it's this ambition that you have, like I want to dunk a basketball, and you believe that you can because you remember a time when you were close, and you think, well, now I'll be able to put in all the work, I'll have the knowledge, I can watch the YouTube videos, and all of that's true. But you don't exactly know where you are. So you don't know exactly how long, nor do you know what your rate of progress will be like with your life as doing whatever it is that you do, with whatever injuries that you may have accumulated. You just know that you're willing to do the thing, and you believe that given enough time that you'll then be able to attain that goal. That's all I'm doing. So I don't know how long it's going to take. We are making progress. You and me, I am making progress. But it's been a journey, and it will continue to be. That's an that I would have edited out if I were editing this. In July of last year, I went with my son Ernest, as he would say, is his name, so it makes sense, to go see the Gold Coast Marathon because it's about an hour away from where I live. And if I were going to run, it would be the most obvious marathon in terms of official marathon to run if that's what I end up doing. That's to be determined. It's in the winter over here, which is important because temperature, heat and humidity are worse for running marathons. That's for anyone, but especially if you've got some size about you, which I do. And so we went to the Gold Coast Marathon, and it aligned with my vibes for, do I want to do this? And that was about the time that I announced, hey, this is what I'm doing, largely publicly, because I was going to be training hard. And I think for anyone training hard, there's a reason, whatever it is. And for me, because people are interested in why are you doing this, because I speak to the importance of context and having reasons, and that's where you get your motivation from by having these goals. Is, well, I can't speak to the reason behind why I want to do the things. That's for another time. But just having the goals means that there's a reason, not only a reason, but a shape to the training, and it adds a intensity, and it also helps the people around you align with what's important. And so they can either, get on board and encourage and check in, or they can at least get out of the way because they know that you are mission focused. And it should look different than it does for other times in your life. There are seasons to this thing. And right now, I'm not even peaking this thing. I'm developing, which means there needs to be space. But I still do all sorts of other things, which are happy compromises, willing compromises, compromises in it. They're not the best thing for training, but they're happy because I do them, not only because I have to, but because I want to, because that's part of the overall tapestry of life that isn't just training. Even when you're a professional athlete, you still have kids' birthday parties and holidays and all the rest of it. So it's never just foot to the floor the whole time. But there is a time when there is a bit more of that, and where there's less scope for stuffing about. Not that I stuff about an awful lot. So last July, post announcement, this was just letting everyone know that I was going to be getting to work, and that's what I've been doing. And it's been a learning process. There's been all sorts of adjustments, which is all training is that is this like a series of adjustments as you go along. So you have a plan in principle as a starting point, and you have an idea of where you want to get to. And it might even be what workouts or what training sessions, what outputs, what distances, what loads that if you were able to produce in training would have you feel confident that you could then achieve the specific goal. Once you have those in mind and you have an idea for where you are, then it's just bridging the gap and adjusting the things as you go, those adjustments. Now, my starting point was uncertain. So a lot of this part has just been feeling it out to know where I'm at, to be able to figure out how I'm going to get to here. And we are getting closer, but it's not been, and it usually isn't a linear process. To start off with the running side of things, I wanted to do as moderately as possible because I'd had this conversation in my head for years that if you started running again, what would that look like? And I gave it a try in that I tried to follow my own advice by starting on grass, so there was minimal impact, and starting with short durations and low intensity to further lower the stress because I'd known that the main thing with my running capacity was whether or not I could continuously run enough to get in running shape. Injuries were, or at least nothing major usually, but the sort of things that they would occur and then they wouldn't go away and they might get worse over time. And then it comes to a point where I'm not a professional runner. Do I need to cripple myself here for this? This is when I was rowing. So these were the conversations. And usually good sense prevailed and I would pull back or adjust. But that's what I'm trying to avoid or at least be sensitive to this go around, that just load management is going to be an important aspect here. So I started off with two 20-minute runs on grass, barefoot, to build up the strength of my feet. Let's start from the ground up. Prior to this, I was doing skipping rope, jump rope, with that in mind, to get some time on my feet in a dynamic motion so that I wasn't even starting from scratch when I started running. So we started, I checked this before, I went back because I wanted to, for myself and for this thingo, where did I start and then where did I go? Well, I started at two 20-minute runs and this would have been after weights. And I'm only going to be really talking about the running aspect today because the weights, the deadlift side of things is going fine in that we're not anywhere near max. And it's going to be a goal that I believe is more attainable than the marathon. So we're closer to a peak there. And it's the sort of thing that I will have it won't be the only peak. I'll have some along the way, but it's still not anywhere nearby, but it's closer in terms of I could reach it quicker as compared to the marathon goal. So the barbell training, the resistance training, which is getting more and more deadlift specific, is going well and in keeping with my goals, but it's also something that I'm percolating and developing whilst I'm more aggressively working on the running side of things. So we started in July. No, actually, let's talk pre-July. This is how things go sometimes when it doesn't go well despite your best intentions. When we were at the Gold Coast Marathon, Ernie had his bike and he was riding around and there was all these footpaths that he could just go and good for him. I was running to try and keep up and hadn't done any running. Like as I mentioned, no running. I'm running in these kind of minimal, inconsequential shoes, which is fine other than if you're running on concrete and you're 110 kilos and haven't run much in a decade. And I could keep up and I was actually thinking, oh, this is good. You know, we're in a good starting point. But then the following day and the day after, my calves were that sore. And then the goal was to start the following week, as in, days later. And I knew that didn't make any sense. I could not start this process with my calves already buggered. That was going to be both silly and bad juju. So I was going to push it out. We pushed it out a week. And then the day before, maybe 2 days before, Ernie and I were on a bike ride on our bike, which is to say my bike, and he's got a little seat. We're riding along, having a good time. Something we've done plenty of times before. So he's got a little seat, sits in front of me, holds on the handlebars. That's what we were doing that day. And we were cruising along maybe 30 Ks an hour. And the pedal, my bike pedal just snapped off. And the cranks came around, we went off. Well, I think I put my foot down and we just toppled that way off the side into the bush and at a decent clip. And I checked him and he was all fine, other than he was, decently upset because we'd gone over the handlebars at 30 clicks. And then someone that had pulled up nearby said, "Hey, mate, you might have a look at the back of your leg." And so I did. And it was just this kind of flayed open on my calf, on my right leg. And I knew this was going to be a trip to the hospital and stitches and nothing more than an inconvenience. But then this was 2 days before this whole training kickoff for this goal was due to commence. And by the time it did, I was so willing to get started that I just started as that those 20-minute runs were with the days after this. So not ideal. But what do? You start with what you have when you have it. And the issue was that because it was feeling good, it seemed like I built too quickly. When I look back, well, I know I did, but there was two 20-minute runs on grass, and then 2 weeks later, it says 45 minutes with hills. That would have been hill sprints, plus 40 minutes on the road. And I was trying to avoid running on the road for a while to lessen the impact for the reasons I've mentioned. And then a week later, it says 60 minutes on sand. And the reason I'm probably running on sand at that stage is because I'm getting signs of impact issues, at least some soreness in my shins. I'd be trying to manage some foot pain, some warning signs of my plantar fascia being like, hey, maybe we don't like the hills. And then a 53-minute run on concrete that same week. So then all of a sudden we've tripled, quadrupled the running volume within a month. So this is not any, and then I can see hill sprints for one run and then 90 minutes on soft sand. So I think the hill sprints, I know. I was doing the hill sprints to lessen the impact because even though the velocity was higher, because the surface is closer, the impact force on my shins is less. And then I would have done the soft sand run to further allow for that. And then I can see that this volume, because I'm not ready for it technically and posturally, means that I was getting tired in certain positions and all of a sudden hip pain. So November, I am trying to manage hip pain by increasing this is lateral pain on the left side, more jump rope, because I'm like, if I can maintain the qualities of my feet and calves and maintain some impact, I'll be better prepared for when I start running again. At this time, I also bought and started using an Echo bike instead of, and I intended and did use the Echo bike as my main cross training tool instead of the bike erg, because they're both good machines, but the arm leg bike, the Airdyne, the assault bike, the Echo bike, they've always felt as though the strain, and that's an abstract term, is more comparable to running for me than the bike is. I feel like training on the Echo bike, or let's call it an arm leg bike, quadruped bike, the arm leg bike, those set you up better for success on a lot of things like the row erg, and in running as compared to just a pure bike. I think biking, especially if you're out and about, and especially it just as a recovery tool in certain contexts, it makes a lot of sense. But for what I'm doing now, I wanted to have that. And so I got that and started using that for all my maintenance of aerobic volume, which included building from 30 to 60 to 90-minute sessions on that pretty quickly through November. By December, I realized I, it didn't make sense to start running again because we were going to be traveling over Christmas and a beach or grass wasn't necessarily going to be accessible. And I didn't want to start running again on concrete. And I wanted to deprioritize my training for that period of time, knowing that that wasn't the focus and that there was going to be an opportunity to ramp it up in the new year. I thought I'll just percolate the qualities that I can, which is to say I'll chip away at the cardio when I can via the Echo bike prior to Christmas, and I will maintain on the strength side of things and certainly don't get injured, which is pretty atypical for me in December, usually around December 31 or January 1. I'm trying to do something psychotic to either set the tone for the new year or to finish on a flurry for the year prior. I've done both and it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I certainly encourage you to do it. It worked for me in a way for a while, but there's many ways to go about it, and a lot to do is with where you are in life. And when you're 17, what works is probably going to be different than when you have kids, for example, especially if your kids are 17. I don't know. I'm not there. So feeling good through December as the hip is gradually improving to feel optimistic about January. January rolls around and I'm doing a combination of hill sprints for one run and then easy longer running for the other on grass and or sand. And I'm doing some jump rope for the same reason. To build up and maintain these lower foot stuff, strength, for want of a better term, durability. I've noticed that this is a thing that could be a liability, is my feet hurt, plantar fascia feels tight. If I am too aggressive with the increase in training or even the intensity, which is just to say how fast I run at this stage and what surface and inclines I run at. So the reason I did the hill sprints is to ensure that I wanted to improve running economy. I felt as though if I could improve my running proficiency and specific strength, that I would have better ability to hold positions when I'm fatigued. The issue is that it was too stressful, all of this on my feet. So I decided that I just needed to back off the hill sprints. I don't need this at this stage. I was just going to get into the habit of trying to run consistently at an easy intensity, ideally on forgiving surfaces like grass and sand, and then to layer in gravel and road as things start to feel a little bit better, which is where I'm at now. So the reason for 2 runs a week was because I felt like I'm not prepared. I need more recovery between runs to do 2 runs. To be, if I could do 2 runs, then I could progress to 3 to 4. And for a while, I was probably trying to then do too much within those 2 runs. And then the adjustment is to distribute the work over 4 sessions, but have each run be a little less intense, to rely a little less on any one of those, but to reduce the intensity where possible. And that seems to be going well, which is to not say that I don't have some lingering issues and some new ones, but this too is part of the process. So feet are a little tender, but that's usually just post run. And then with 1 or 2 recovery days here and there in the week, which is what I have, I tend to be able to be pretty good by the time the next runs are around. I've noticed that my knees are hurting a little bit, but they don't seem to feel too bad when I run. It's great. But on the Echo bike, they do. And given that that's a supplementary tool to aggravate an issue uh, when it's not the primary focus, does seem a bit silly. So I'm trying to work my way around that by doing a little bit more running volume, to do a lot of soft tissue work on my quads and some isometric stuff to try and improve the qualities of my patella tendons. Most likely seems like that's where the aggravation is occurring more in the left than the right, but I do believe this can get better over time and just a matter of management at the moment. So the hip is good. The feet and shins are okay, pretty good. And knees a bit sore, but we're working around it. I'm even thinking of joining a civilian gym to maybe go use their elliptical just to have it as a tool. Overlaid with all of this is the challenge of the climate where I am at this time of year, which is subtropical, so hot and humid every day. And by hot, I mean it's 28 to 30 degrees every day, and humidity is 80%, well, 75% average, but maybe then it's 90 to 60, depending on the time of day. It's hard to avoid. And so I don't. I I've thought about all sorts of contingencies, like doing my Echo bike sessions in my son's bedroom because there's air conditioning there. There's air conditioning in our bedroom too, but there's not enough space, and I don't think my wife would find that favorable. I don't even know if I can pull off the in his bedroom because there tends to be a lot of sweat, but it's the only way to not be just by default doing both heat and humidity training every time you train. And I don't mind it, but it adds an additional factor for the recoverability. The hope is that as the year continues to progress and we change through the seasons into the fall and into the winter, fall, autumn, into fall and into winter, then it gets less humid and less hot, and I get the benefit of having trained in these challenging. It's the poor man's altitude, as if someone DM'd me about that, and I think that makes sense. It's a training stress. It provides the reason for physiological adaptations. It compromises your output in the meantime, but with the opportunity to get a training and performance pop off the other side with the benefit of these adaptations. But you would still then need to go about doing artificial heat training probably once a week to maintain these qualities over the had a sauna. That would be, and I will, that would be a good way to go about it. Passive heat would maintain that over the winter. But for the time being, maybe an elliptical in an air-conditioned gym once a week for right now will make sense. I'll let you know. This is exciting stuff. This is how we adjust. I would go into this is what I'm doing each day of the week, but there's plenty of time for that. That's probably enough on my training for now. So, questions? Let me hydrate. Thanks for sending these in. By the way, if you have questions, if you feel as though you have an inquiry that would align with some of the ones that I'm asking, or would be a nice deviation from what you're hearing, but you would like me to comment on some aspect of your life, something that you're trying to do, or some problem you're trying to solve, please DM me wherever you feel inclined to, either at Sam Locke on Instagram or at Mostly Training, also on Instagram. Send them in. This week, looking back at your career, what's one training or recovery method that you wish you had prioritized earlier? And then the next question is, well, I'll just answer the first part first because they're not that related. Well, yeah, no, they are. They're not. They aren't. one training or recovery method you wish you had prioritized earlier, and I'd say recovery, but it's mostly sleep because a lot of the recovery things that you would hope to emphasize the attention to nutrient timing, attention to hot, cold, contrast therapy, soft tissue therapy, mobility. I did all of that stuff, but I didn't get a lot of sleep. This is when I was rowing, and I have reflected on this as well. You could have done that better. At that time and less now, just a night owl. I always had been inclined to stay up late and would then stay up late and would not feel fully recovered in the morning, often most likely, and then would think, this doesn't feel good, and then do training and live as normal. And then by the time bed rolled around, I would not feel tired. I would feel like, oh, I can get a few things done here. This is where I could do my research or whatever else, just hanging out, just being a person that maybe wasn't a rower at that, just for that sliver of the day. And then I would feel tired again the next morning, and I would endeavor to shift this. And over time, I was slightly more successful, but on balance, that was a thing that I could have done better if I'd treated it with the same attention that I treated these other things. I had some beliefs that I was shedding from college where there was this I could sleep when I'm dead kind of thing, because there were chunks of time where I didn't sleep a lot and was training at a high level. My brain was working okay, that I felt like, okay, well, you can do this, one can do this, a person can do this, I can do this. And then, no, I think I was just compromised, but I was young enough to be able to tolerate it, which is never the goal. The next question is, how do you navigate your current training for the marathon and deadlift when life throws you a curveball? Well, as I talked about with training itself, it's been a series of curveballs. It's unless things progress perfectly, and perfect might be even optimistic, there's still going to be curveballs in the way of weather and life and God knows what. So you have to be willing to adjust. And that's the main thing, is I would say a willingness to adjust, to realize that it's okay to make changes as needed, especially if the goal's not very nearby, and especially if the goal's not nearby, because that means that you've got a lot of time to adjust. As you get closer, it gets a bit more consequential, but that should only be for certain portions of the year. And that really should only be important if relative to how much you're investing to this goal. So if you've gone in big and it's really close, then it's harder to make adjustments. But if you have to, because something important comes up, something to do with your family, then all you do is the next best thing. Play it as it comes, because mourning what was is exercise in futility, because it's already gone. It's vapor. All you have is what's in front of you, and what you have in front of you is directly related to what's going on with the people around you. So you got to get on with it, and that means practically, for example, because we're on a property here, I have plans in terms of what training might look like. But if a tree falls over and I need to move it or chop it up with an axe, that might have an impact on when or how I go about doing things. Or what was it, like a week and a half ago, my whole family got hit with gastro. That had an impact. I just adjusted training for that week as much as was necessary to be able to just not make stupid decisions. Think in terms of the long game. It's going to make it easier to digest whatever you have to do in the meantime. So how do I navigate training? Just as needed. Question for the pod, Sam. With young kids, what are your thoughts on training while sleep deprived? I row surf boats, and while only a social sport, we train 6 days a week with a few double sessions in there, all up about 10 hours a week of intensity. Last week we had a sleepless night and I did my ergs, the arvo and injured my elbow. Can't help but think it might not have happened if I was rested. Then again, I think what David Goggins would have say about it, and then just get on with it. Do you think it would be more beneficial to skip that day and then get back to it while better rested? The only reason the season only has about 6 weeks left, so every session counts more than it would earlier in the season. Cheers, mate. Okay, I would say that you've got to listen to David Coggins. Why do I keep saying Coggins? David Goggins in context of like it doesn't mean just run through a wall because David Goggins would tell you that you're a pussy if you didn't. You still have to do what makes sense. And if you were dragging ass going to training because you hadn't slept, if you were feeling good and up for it, I would say do it. If you were feeling like this is going to do more harm than it provides benefit, then I'd say not to do it. And that's hard when you're training with a group. But if you're otherwise really consistent and have demonstrated that to your teammates and they've demonstrated that to you, and that's the culture, we show up and we train. But sometimes life happens. And if someone's not there, then there's a good reason for it. I would say it's better to pull the plug, live to fight another day. In this instance, you hurt yourself, and maybe there's a connection between the two, maybe not, but it seems like you're making the connection, which means you're thinking maybe it wasn't the smartest thing that you went to training, and maybe that you shouldn't always listen to the David Goggins in your head. Realize always that it's not the training that you can tolerate, it's the training that you can thrive in and sustain for a long period of time that works. When you're getting close to a competition, the balance shifts a little bit, but you still, if it's 6 weeks out, you need to be there uninjured at the end, which means you need to be able to tolerate all of the work. And if one session risking it blows up the likelihood of being able to do more of that training because you're trying to do more that week as opposed to more over the next 6 weeks, then you're playing the wrong game. And so I would just it needs to come from a place of confidence. It's hard to do this if you feel like I'm not good at this and my teammates will think that I'm a pussy and or anything along those lines. If you can get to a place where you feel like I do 100% of the work 95% of the time. So on occasion, when this happens, it's not an issue. You just focus on recovery that day, or you do an easier session, whether it's yoga or it's you do something steady on the bike as opposed to just doing the prescribed erg work. I know it's not always easy, and it would be good to have context of what the rest of the training week looks like and what are the priority sessions. But with that in mind, I would add some sessions are more important than others. If every session feels like do or die, then the quality of all of them is probably not very high, especially if it's 6 days a week with a few multiples. So it might be 8, 9, 10 sessions a week. If they're all intense, then the quality is probably pretty low. There should be some really focused hard sessions, and then sessions that are a bit easier, more presence of mind for technical focus as opposed to whether or not you're going to die. Something to keep in mind if you have any influence over the training that you do. Final question. Ooh, a fun one. Hey, as a question for the podcast, I know this isn't in the approaches to training bucket and could be problematic, but would you talk more about the issues with the Australian men's eight leading into the Beijing Olympics? I don't think it'll be problematic. We'll talk about it. I have spoken about it, but this seems like a good venue. Hmm. How long are we going here? Don't know. Let's get into it. This will be the final thing we do here today together. Um, okay, well, for those that don't know, in Beijing, in the Australian men's eight, we finished in sixth place in the final, which, depending on how you look at it, that could be great. You're in the final at the Olympic Games, which is better than not being in the final at the in the A final at the Olympic Games. But if you are in the final, you have a sort of 50% shot, given there are six boats in, of coming away with a medal. And everyone there, especially in that boat class, has aspirations of medaling. So sixth place is not considered a success, and it certainly didn't feel like that to me. And I could say for the people involved with the boat that year. What I can speak to is my perspective, and you would have people that rode in that boat for races and sessions because of sickness or injury or trialing different people, coaches, the cocks, the guys that didn't make the crew or didn't end up in the crew, guys that were in the squad, the support staff, the other coaches, people involved with Rowing Australia would all have their opinion if they were involved with what we were doing at that time. And theirs would be, let's assume, as accurate as mine. So I just want, with all of this caveat in mind, in 2006, the Australian men's eight won the Poznan World Cup in 5:21, which, as you know, is pretty fast for Australia for a men's eight. Very, very fast for an Australian men's eight. I think that was the fastest Australian men's eight ever at that time. Uh, from that crew in 2006, which is 2 years prior to the Beijing Olympics, there was four guys that ended up in the eventual Beijing eight. There were three guys that ended up in the men's four. There was one guy that ended up as the Olympic reserve, an eventual Olympic medalist. And then one guy retired and ended up, from memory, coaching the Dutch crew that we raced against 2 years later. That's another story for a different time. So that crew showed an awful lot of promise, winning that World Cup by 3 and a bit seconds, which is over a length, a chunk of margin in a World Cup in 5:21. And then 2 years later, sixth in the Olympic final. Hence the disappointment relative to what was believed to be achieved or achievable. And then it obviously didn't go that way. So why? And again, I only have my perspective. The things I can own. Two things come to mind. Well, two things for today. One was I had a couple of conversations with the coach and the coach of the men's eight, who was the head coach at the time. Rest in peace, Brian Richardson, and he was coming at this from a place of having a similar body type as me and being a two-time Olympic rower in the men's eight. He had a perspective, and this is just for bigger guys that were short, how to manage that. And his suggestion to me and another guy at the time was that we basically couldn't be any bigger, thicker, sort of in terms of, front to back, couldn't be any thicker in the legs because it was going to limit our range and our range of motion, our length, because we were going to have to row with guys that were 6'10" legitimately. And the way to do that was for us not to be any bigger than we were, probably in fact to be less, as smaller than we were. And at that stage, I was already pretty whittled down from a normal body weight set point to probably in the mid 90 kilos, maybe, probably 95 to maybe 96 to 94, 93, around that time. And from some of these conversations and knowing that this is the coach of the men's eight and this is what he expects, I'm going to keep going in that direction, even though I'm starting to notice some compromise in terms of energy. And also that in a lot of instances, so for example, imagine rowing along, you've got a heart rate monitor on and you're working hard, you've got a crew next to you, you're doing this, who's winning, it's all competitive and everyone's working their tail off. And my heart rate would have been 115. So I just didn't have a lot of energy a lot of the time, but very competitive, very fit, decently strong. So I was able to do all right for my standards, which is to say be competitive and in that mix. But I didn't need to go that far in that direction. It became unhealthy, and that's because I made it as competitive as I made everything else. So around 2007, I was walking an additional 3 hours a week on top of 3 hours a day on top of all the training just to get additional volume and to create less time to eat and to create more of a calorie deficit with kind of the minimal compromise in terms of creating additional training fatigue. Of course, it was too much, wasn't helpful. I was already doing too much. I didn't need to do this. But this was me getting after it within the context of what I needed to do to get in the crew in my mind at the time. I would have, so I couldn't have been bringing my best in that regard. By the time I got to Beijing, I had overcome a lot of this and was in an upward curve. But that is something that, as far as that campaign, there was too much focus for me on that as being as important as everything for me was important, which meant that things that were less important were treated as equally important as these other things, which were clearly a bigger priority. But everything was up here for me because I felt like if there was any deficiency, that was going to be an issue. That would be a reason not to select me. So I wasn't going to have any liabilities, which meant that if you said I needed to be a matchstick, I will turn into a matchstick. I don't know, whatever. And so that's something I can own because that's on me, even though some of the aspects of the environment nudged me in that direction. The other thing is there were times with the campaign where I felt like we were headed in a direction that wasn't helping, that there were things we were doing that didn't make a lot of sense. And I, at the time, was leveraging my experience in rowing in men's eights, which, because I went to college in the US, was more than basically everyone else, even though they'd had more experience on the Australian team than I had. There were some guys in our crew, multiple Olympians, and when at times it looked like there didn't feel like there was an issue with what we were doing, then I wasn't vocal. I already felt like I was being too vocal, given that I was the least experienced in terms of this is my second national team. I was the third youngest guy in the crew. So there were times when I thought I'm not going to overstep my role here, and maybe there were other ways I could have gone about it. But there was there's a lot of times where I felt like what we were doing was not going to end in the way that we wanted it to. And the main thing you need is to believe in the process that you're doing. That's it's the main thing about any training program is, do you believe that it works? If you do, then there's a really good chance it will. And if you don't, there's a really good chance that it won't. And even if I had judgments about what we were doing, you still show up every day making your absolute best of it. But there were compromises. One thing that I'll talk about specifically, and I don't want to throw anyone under the bus here, but this is what happened. We were doing heat training because in Beijing, it was supposed to be really hot and humid, basically like pretty much like what it is here every day. And it has an impact, but we were looking at the averages and the peaks, and everyone was very concerned as though this wouldn't be kind of just as hot, not even as hot as every New South Wales State Championships at Penrith in February every year for like the last couple of decades. And people race 100 times over the weekend. And for the most part, everyone's fine. But because it was going to be at the Olympics in China, there was a bit of a shit fit about our preparedness to be able to manage the heat. And we know now of all the benefits of heat training. So it wasn't wrong to go about treating it as a reasonable approach to developing attributes. Even if we weren't in the heat, it would still be useful because of all of the benefits I'm hoping to glean from the heat training I'm doing now, which is largely just improve physiological efficiency when it's not as hot and humid. So in our efforts to prepare for this in Beijing, we were at one stage doing ergs in a heated room in full training kit. So beanies, long sleeves, short sleeves over long sleeve, multiple layers, leggings, as much as you could kind of go about it. And then we were given sessions on the erg, and the outputs would have been very moderate, but it both felt like it was too hot. And I think that the atmosphere didn't need to be hot if we were going to be in the hot suits, or we could have just done a hot room and not done the hot suits, but we did both. I wouldn't also think that the erg is good because you've got these numbers and you either have to be detached from them and just accept that you're going to have pathetic output, which is really hard to do when you've seen that number for 15 years. And the better it is, the like that's what you're going for basically every stroke. And then all of a sudden it just doesn't matter when you're preparing for the Olympics. Like that's not easy to do. And I had a hard time with it, but my numbers were pathetic anyway because it was too hot. I could speak for myself, but I know that I wasn't the only person. In fact, a decent chunk of a 8-man crew eventually dealt with similar like issues. I'm talking heart stuff. So this was starting to be some of the first occurrences that I had of going into supraventricular tachycardia. So heart rate going from 160-ish, like we're working hard. This is threshold to 220, 230, and feeling like I'm rowing in porridge. I could barely breathe. And at the time, you're just like, well, I just keep rowing. Just what are you going to do? Like, I'm not going to stop because my heart rate's high. That created a lot of fatigue for me in the days to come. And then it was this repeated thing, which I didn't know what to make of, and certainly wasn't going to be saying, oh, I've got this heart issue when we're a couple of months out from the Olympic Games. That'd be a reason to take me out, a reason to feel like I'm a liability. And because I wasn't the only guy that was having that sort of thing. So amongst us, a couple of us, like, oh, this is a new normal. But that probably didn't help. I'm still dealing and have done with some of that, as have other guys. I'd, they're very specific things. One is something I could have done better. Two things I could have done better. I'm sure there's a long list of maybe 100 things. That heat training is just one small thing. The one small large thing, but it's only just one thing. It wouldn't even be that. I can keep going. We had a training camp that was largely doing our longer rows on the Brisbane River, which is super tidal. And this is a point where we need to do kind of a long volume, long, steady rows that weren't windy and where we couldn't gauge speed at all. But that's where we did that camp to, in part, get to warmer water. But there are other places we could have gone. There was the reality that we were in the village at the Olympics when I think every other men's eight, bar the US, were staying in accommodation nearby. So it was 45 minutes when they were flying to maybe an hour plus, hour 15 when it was bad to go from the village to the course. And recognizing this, I say we, it wasn't up to me. I actually asked that we make this change, but it wasn't agreed to that we were going back and forth twice a day. So that could have been up to 4 hours in a bus in the week prior to in the days prior to and during the Olympic regatta. Uh, there were people's back issues because of this were getting more and more aggravated. James Chapman, this is what happened. So I don't think he would mind me sharing it. Had to kneel like this had to kneel because sitting in a chair or sitting on the floor, it all hurt. And if we were there were other crews even within our program that made the adjustment to, okay, well, we'll do one row and we'll stay at the course. We'll go to the little team recovery center, chill out there for a bit, even though that's not ideal. That's better than driving all the way back. Do a second row, drive back, maybe do some cross training in the afternoon. Now, we did that, but we just didn't do that nearly enough. So we spent a lot of time on the bus and people were getting stiff and people were getting sick by the time the final rolled around. Or I remember when we were going for rows, every time we turned, there were half the crew that were coughing up phlegm and spitting out the side of the boat. I had a little bit of that. Some of it would have been better or worse, but that was a lot of the crew. Again, that's not going to be the reason, but when everything's going well, that's the sort of thing that isn't happening. In the heat, the day of the heat, this perfect storm rolled through. When I say perfect storm, the sort of spattering of rain, nice, pushy, but stable tail breeze that the races, as they were due to roll out, the men's quad came down, and our men's quad, I believe, broke the world record or world's best time. So the conditions were fast. And I was thinking, we were like, despite all of that stuff, we're on here, like we're going to come together at the last moment because we're racers and we've all proven it at different stages. And in the time between the men's quad where they broke the world record and our heat, they called off racing for the day. And they said, just, we'll come back tomorrow, we'll let you know. And that happens on occasion. Rowing's an outdoor sport. But at this stage, we've probably had like 400 milligrams of caffeine, some bicarb soda at this stage. And we haven't had, like, we're horses, like, ready to race. And then it's just, our coach, Richo, said, okay, get back on the bus. And I said, could you reckon we could go maybe just sit on the ergs for a little bit or sit on the bikes? And he's like, get on the bus. And like, okay. As we walk past every other men's eight that's doing what I just suggested, and because you had to blow off a little bit of steam. And we came out the next day to row our actual heat, in which we were racing the Canadian crew who were the reigning world champions and the likely favorites for the gold medal. So we're going to get a real test straight away. And out of the blocks, we're actually pretty good, at least as good as we have been next to those guys recently. From memory, first few 100 meters we're next to them. And then they are pushing a little bit. It's not as though we're having this, but we're all in the hunt. We're right there. And then our fin falls off in the heat of the Olympic Games. Our fin falls off and our Cox is doing everything just to keep us in the lane. We start swinging across into the Canadians' lane. And if we hit them, we're disqualified. Whereas if we can just navigate the rest of the distance, and this is all happening in an instant, we know that we can go to the repechage and at least we'll then have a shot to get in the final. But this has all happened in a moment and we're adjusting and we do, and we have this very unceremonious row. And that was my Olympic debut. We recovered enough in the repechage. We had a decent row. I can't remember where we came, which is me showing the time ago that this occurred, but we weren't scraping into the final from memory. We were there. We're still with expectations to contend, but we hadn't done anything to indicate that we were going to be at the front of the field when it mattered. And in the final, we were there sort of to start, but then pretty quickly we weren't. Um, we were blown right out the back, which in a men's eight, when it's going well, it goes great, and when it's not, it goes worse. And when it's really not, that's what you were looking at. And I couldn't explain why it was so bad in particular that day, but I would look at that and go, okay, that was probably the one of the worst rows that I can remember having as a crew in recent memory in terms of years and years and years. And you can't quite put your finger on it. And it was the worst time for it to happen. I think it felt a little bit as though because we didn't get to race the heat, that the repechage felt like a heat. And then the final kind of felt like the intensity was up and we weren't there to match it. We weren't on the money when we needed to be. So there is a lot of intangibles, and the stuff I've mentioned is just a couple of the ins and outs. There was personnel change, and there were guys in the crew that were very good, but I think by their own admission would say that they weren't the fittest that they've ever been. So they were good enough to make the crew, and they were good enough to be very successful at the Olympic Games, but maybe left their preparation in the cycle a little bit late. And the reasons for the disappointment are obvious, but just for additional context, the Australian men's four, who was in the lower priority boat in principle for that year, even though all those guys had been in the eight previously, everyone was of a similar standard. They decided that the pair who were the reigning world champions, they were going to do their own thing. That was the top boat. Then the men's eight, then the men's four. The men's four that didn't make the eight won the Olympic silver medal in the same year at the same regatta, which shows you something about what the standard was of that squad, which of course makes the disappointment more, not less. That's about all I can say on that today. I'd have to think about more, and this is something that probably I think about less and less. It's good to talk about because these are some stuff that, if not for some reason, it's not really talked about. When I showed up the next year, I was the only person from that crew, including the coach, including the Cox, that was there the following season. And then because they'd been new head coach, new high performance director, they were kind of like, well, what went wrong the year before? Like, what did you do wrong the year before? Because you guys didn't go well in the final. And we're thinking the guys that came second at the Olympics, they did well. So we like them and good. And then you came sixth, which is not as good. So why did that happen? And I could mention some of the things that I discussed today. There's probably some other stuff that was fresher at the time. I was still young and not managing myself well in every instance. So I could probably ruffled feathers here and there. I probably could have been more supportive of guys in our boat, guys in the squad. I probably could have been more assertive at certain times and less assertive at others. Could have taken care of my body better. Most certainly could have had a more healthy disposition to certain metrics as compared to others within the broader selection context. But I also think we were poorly managed because I didn't I didn't touch the fin. I didn't have anything to do with that, so that can't be me. And I didn't decide where we went on certain training camps. I didn't decide who was in the crew or how it was selected or how we trained. But this is what it's like in any men's eight or any eight, any women's eight. I can only speak to men's eights because they're the only ones I've coached or rode in. When it goes well, it's great because it's more than the sum of its parts, and all of this stuff that's tedious, when it's pushed in the right direction and works, it feels great. And when it doesn't, which is often a lot of the time, there are things you can point to that maybe if it had gone well, you would reflect differently on, but it didn't go well. And these are results that we live with forever. And so, of course, I'm going to think about the reasons why, because if it were anything else that were important to me, you do have to think of the reasons why. And I showed up again in the 2012 to try and do some of those better. Unfortunately, even though we were able to give a better account of ourselves, more or less the same result, although a lot closer. I can talk about that another time, though. Today, thank you for your time. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you like this podcast, especially if you're still listening, feel free to like in wherever you are. Just push a button, subscribe, maybe tell a person or two about it. That tends to help. If you have a question, let me know. Otherwise, see you next week.